Thank you, Suzanne, very much. And thank you, Raven Foundation friends, for joining us for the celebratory workshop weekend. For the first portion of the workshop, Hard Times for Truth, we have our two speakers, Andrew McKenna and Heidi Stillman. Dr. Andrew McKenna is professor of French language and literature at Loyola University in Chicago. He now teaches inmates currently incarcerated in the Illinois prison system literature and theology. For the decade between 1996 and 2006, he was the editor-in-chief of Contagion, Journal of Violence, Mimesis, and Culture. Andrew is the author of Violence and Difference, Girard, Derrida, and Deconstruction. Heidi Stillman is a playwright, actress, and Jeff Award-winning director and ensemble member of Looking Glass Theater in Chicago. The current artistic director, Heidi, served previously as artistic director of New Work at Looking Glass and won the Raven Award for her adaptation of The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. She has both written and directed at Looking Glass, following Cascabel, The North China Lover, Hephaestus, The Brothers Karamazov, Hard Times, of course, and The Master and Margarita. Directing work with Looking Glass includes Death Tax, Bengal Tiger at the Baghdad Zoo, Trust, The Wooden Greeks, and Hillbilly Antigone. Additional writing credits with Looking Glass include The Last Act of Lilka Caddison, The Old Curiosity Shop, and The Baron in the Trees. So regarding the open format, this is going to be tricky. Regarding the open format for the first panel, we planned it around a series of questions about the work, about Hard Times. And I'll pose the questions first to Heidi and then to Andrew. Heidi and Andrew, you are, of course, welcome to respond to each other throughout. We're going to reserve the last portion of the panel for a Q&A. However, the speakers are very open. If anyone would like to jump in throughout, please feel welcome to do so.
So to begin, Heidi, I wanted to congratulate you on the success of Hard Times.
Thank you.
I'm so excited to see it tomorrow for the first time. I know Andrew already has. In rereading the novel and experiencing the play, readers and viewers alike are struck by the contemporary poignancy of Hard Times. How would you describe the relevancy that the work has for us today? I guess, in short, why this play at this time?
Well, we did this play in a long time ago, like 2000 or 1999, and then in 2001, or maybe it was 2001 the first time. But we were heading towards our 30th anniversary. This season is our 30th anniversary season, which I can't believe that the company has been going that long. And congratulations to you for the 10-year anniversary. That's really exciting. So we were thinking about some of, our plays in the past, and was there anything that we would like to bring back kind of in celebration of our 30th anniversary? And as we were talking and thinking, we were realizing that Hard Times still felt really relevant. And this was actually before the election. And it became even more relevant with the election. So I think, some of the things we were thinking about was, there's a lot of stuff in the book about income inequality, if you will, our modern terminology for it. But, a lot of the problems that come along with our capitalist system. So, there are speeches that the Stephen character has in Hard Times that could be said by a person living in the city of Chicago in 2017 in a shocking way, and in a really clearly articulated way. We did a play last year called Beyond Caring, which was about temporary workers in Chicago, completely contemporary play. But it had many of the same echoes. And then with the presidential election, it suddenly came even more into focus. So, one of the main characters in Hard Times is Bounderby, who likes to think of himself as a self-made man, doesn't have much empathy or respect for anyone who hasn't brought themselves up by their bootstraps, because that's what he did, and what one person can do, another person can do. He's always on the gold spoon lookout. He's looking for people he's always alert for people who are looking for a handout or a help up that he had never received. He's interested in this. She's a little girl at the beginning of the book, becomes a young woman and marries her. I mean, there are so many parallels that are, it's a little bit, it was a little bit shocking. And so there's a lot of relevancies right now too. And then I think also, all the facts, the facts versus imagination, all of those are so relevant. I mean, he was, Dickens is such a genius, and he got, right to the heart of it when he's writing then, and it's amazing that we're still kind of facing the same situations, and that were happening then. That's one of the things I love about doing adaptation, especially of stuff that's in the distance, just that kind of dialogue you're having with someone from over the distance of all those years. I find that really moving and interesting. I guess that's what I like about books in general. But yeah, and I'm sure Andrew can speak.
It's amazing. It's scandalous, and we'll talk more about that we have to reinvent truth and re-argue it, the need for it. What I like to do is quote a little bit from Dickens, but here's a quote from Hannah Arendt. The thing about hard times in these times, Dickens had no idea. Of course he did, because there are prophetic moments in the book, and they're very, very explicitly prophetic. But I want to say, Charles, you have no idea how right you are, because he's speaking exactly to our times. Here's a quote from Hannah Arendt. She says, "The result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that lies will now be accepted as truth, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world is being destroyed." And I mean, that's our moment. And lots of journalists are talking about precisely this crisis of fact versus opinion, of knowledge versus information. My let's say, supplement to what Heidi was just saying is to say, quote, one of these passages from Stephen Blackpool, where he's talking about the workers and the state and the laborers and capital. And he's describing our times as follows. "Look how you consider us and write of us and talk of us and goes up with your deputations to secretaries of state about us, and how you're always right and how we're always wrong and never had no reason in us since ever we were born. Look how this is growing and growing, sir, bigger and bigger, broader and broader, harder and harder, from year to year, from generation unto generation. Who can look on it, sir, and fairly tell a man 'tis not a muddle?" And muddle is Dickens' word for this unholy mixture of values, statements, and everything else. There are the moments where Stephen Blackpool is describing the fate of the working poor, and again, it's an embarrassment of riches. I've quotes all over the place. You don't want to go on. But no, really, I mean, this novel speaks directly to the crisis of difference that we're dealing with now between, truth and untruth, between fact and opinion, and the muddle of science, religion, and politics, which are supposed to have separate domains, and we have constitutional documents to that effect. And now we're in this muddle. So that's all I have to add to that.
Yeah, and well, I was going to say too, the Bounderby character. I've said he has this narrative of himself as a self-made man, but it turns out it's not actually true. I forgot to say that part of it. Which it has some echoes of that narrative. That's
well, the Boundary. Dickens describes it as the bully of humility, because he's the self-made man. I mean, this is this bloviating, blustering, self-justifying character who puts down and comes out in the play. The workers, they've never had it so good, and they want venison and turtle soup served with a silver spoon. Here's a passage, for instance, which comes right out of our congressional debates, and it's worth quoting if I can wrap up the gospel. Where you could think you're listening to the congressional record. This is one of these things with professors, they can never find their head. But this, I mean, it's simply uncanny. Let me see. I'm sorry, but there is this idea that these are the best working conditions. And there are passages again and again out of the mouth of Bounderby that these people want everything done for them, which is literal, out there, truth covered, quoted in the press. And that's what Dickens is already describing as the way the wealth justifies itself. It repeats its own slogans again and again and again with the silver spoon.
Yeah. I also am finding, just in the last weeks or so with the whole Harvey Weinstein scandal, and that there's echoes of that in the story too, in the way especially that he is towards Louisa, the Bounderby character is, and just the place of women. I love the two young women in the play are really beautiful characters and very very wonderful female characters. I apologize. I am really sick, so in case I sound like, or in case I cough or blow my nose or something, I apologize.
No, you sound great.
Okay.
Wonderful. Well, we'll come back to the question of the relevancy of hard times over and over throughout the panel. Yeah. I did want to ask Heidi, as you, of course, have written the adaptation of Hard Times for the stage, I'd love if you could discuss some of the challenges you encountered during that process. And Andrew, I know you've already seen the play, so perhaps you can speak to that question as well, of how the play was adapted for the stage. How the novel was adapted.
What's interesting is I adapted it like 20 years ago, and coming back to it was really interesting. I realized at a certain point, this is somebody else's play. This was Heidi 20 years ago, and that was kind of really interesting. But I think I did an okay job, and I changed a little bit as we were doing, just to kind of just to make sure everything was hitting. But I don't know, the challenges of adapting, to me, it's all what's fun about it is easier to talk about than the challenges. But we had talked about how the Coketon, the town, is such a character in the book. It's kind of this overriding atmosphere that they're living in that's very it's always being described as smoke and bricks, and it's not a beautiful place. It's a utilitarian city, and it's a made up city, but it's full of factory and mill workers, and the river is dyed black from the dye of the mills of the fabric, and so it's this really kind of oppressive utilitarian setting that's very present throughout the book and very symbolic and metaphoric. But I don't have like a narrator. Sometimes I like a narrator, but sometimes I really don't like a narrator in adaptations. So the set design and the lighting design end up pulling a lot of the weight of the location and that oppressive location. So if you come to see it, Dan, the set designer, made these huge, like, imposing kind of metal structures. It's almost like scaffolding that can open and close and move around. And so all the various locations were were moving. And we had the idea too of the actors doing a lot of the moving and setting of things. So it looks like this busy industrial town, that's always working and always moving. We also have a lot of haze, which is a lighting thing, so it has this kind of like smoky feel to it as well. And then there's places in the dialogue where I've tried to say some of that, because Bounderby talks a lot about that when he's introducing this new character, Harthouse. Do you see our smoke? It's the healthiest thing in the world. It's particularly for the lungs. He talks about the mills, how it's the best place to work. It's the lightest work there is. It's the best paid. We couldn't improve the mills unless we laid down turkey carpets on the floor, which we're not going to do. He talks about the mill workers with the, looking for turtle soup and venison with a gold spoon. But so, there's ways in which we get the Coketon in there too. I also was really interested in the circus part of it. I always loved circus. I'm a little obsessed with circus. I love the metaphor of circus. Not being earthbound. I always think there's a lot of longing in circus because they're doing things that we wish we could do or that the human body can't really do, but they're doing it. So the character of Louisa, her father has this school, and she's like the perfect student. But they get caught peeping at the circus that comes to town, and my idea is that and it's true in the book too, that the circus like really sparks the beginning of her opening to the world in a different way than her father has trained her to. And the little girl she sees in the circus ends up living at their house. And the Louisa character is very stoic and doesn't show a lot. So I had the idea of using the circus as as kind of an inside window into what her longings and her imagination was. So she's using the little bits that she saw at the circus to kind of people her imagination. So that was actually like my big way into the adaptation, was realizing I could do that. And trying to kind of pull, like the sissy character in the book kind of drops out for a huge amount of time. And I tried to make that less, so that circus element that circus thread of the metaphor, the fact versus fancy, the rational versus the irrational, that could still be present in the play, in a solid way. So I don't know, I'm going on and on. But
no, that's great. I think you're definitely answering the question. I love the idea of the circus as bringing out the interiority of the characters and the imagination. That's great.
Yeah.
And Andrew, I don't know if you wanted to address the question as well, having seen the play, and speak to that difference between the novel and the play.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil it.
No spoilers.
There's a lot of, let's say, prose commentary that obviously you can't introduce into a dramatic scene with players. And the work of fancy and imagination is very effectively done on stage as a foil, because Sissy Jupe is a perfect foil for Louisa, and you get to appreciate that. And by the way, I also, as a child, every year we were taking the Madison Square Garden to the Barnum and Bailey, Ringling Brothers.
Yeah, I used to go to those.
By the way, only closed recently. But you see, in our end of the circus, all that was taken over by media, and now we have all this technology. And the circus for Dickens is precisely the place for imagination, and by the way, it's also, and this comes out in the prose passages of the novel, that we're embodied creatures. You see, because Gradgrind's idea is just the facts term, it's factors. So he reduces everything to geometric formulas, and his system, as it's called, is a totally disembodied view of reality. And the role of the circus is precisely to bring that forward. And again, yes, I share with you a love of circuses, but they're gone. Our entertainment industry no longer supports that kind of activity.
And I think you're both gesturing at this question I want us to focus on a little bit more about how from the very beginning of the novel, we're given this harsh dichotomy between fact, which is synonymous with calculation and with utility and with certainty, and originally, of course, with Gradgrind and with Bounderby and with Machokum Child, right? What a Dickensian character, Machokum Child.
What a name.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Yeah.
So we're given this side of fact, and then we're given a fancy. And there's a chapter, I believe, titled Never Wonder. Never fancy, never imagine. We have fancy with a capital F. So I wondered if you could speak to both of you to that dichotomy in the novel, and perhaps moments or scenes or characters where they question those strict definitions of those two.
Sure. I mean, that is kind of that's kind of the thesis that's set up right at the beginning, and it is in the play too, and then it's pulled all the way through till the very end, where it ends up fighting Mr. Gradgrind. His school does. Yes, I mean, it's really peopled all the way through, juxtaposing those two things, because Sissy comes and lives in the house, so it's like both of the things are under one roof, and we get to watch which way it's going to go. And like you were saying earlier when we were talking with Dickens, it is fancy, that it is imagination and fancy that's going to win in the end. But Mr. Gradgrind's ideas about facts are missing some other truths, in that he's missing the kind of truth of the irrational, and truth of relationship, and truth of the imagination and the imaginative impulse. So by the end of it, Mr. Gradgrind has kind of grown. But yeah,
he's grown. Actually, it's not really growth, but maybe progressive. He has collapsed. Be careful about a word. He is reborn into the world of imagination. And I'll just read a brief passage in that chapter called Never Wonder. And by the way, it's sort of, he brings it back, never wonder, never wonder. But this is where he's describing the library in Copeland. He says, it was a disheartening this is the narrator, but a melancholy fact that even these readers persisted in wondering. They wondered about human nature, human passions, human hopes and fears, about the struggles, triumphs and defeats, the cares and joys and sorrows, the lives and deaths of common men and women. This is Dickens' job description. They sometimes, after 15 hours' work, sat down to read more fables about men and women, more or less like themselves, and about children, more or less like their own. Again, Dickens was the first to introduce children into fiction, ahead of the Brontes, ahead of Dostoevsky, whom he influenced very, very powerfully. They took the foe to their bosoms instead of Euclid. Mr. Gradgrind was forever working in print and out of print at this eccentric sum, and he never could make out how it yielded this unaccountable product. You can't account. This is the brief we had for fiction, that it's human experience over time in a certain context, and that it is irreducible to formulas. And we now have, in higher ed, there's a capitulation, to scientific prestige, because it's so effective and it's so dazzling. We have all these gadgets and phones and all that, and things like that. It's very impressive. It's very seductive. And Dickens blows the whistle on that addiction through and through and through.
And talking about fact and fancy, which are intimately tied up with education in the novel from that opening that we have in those first few chapters. I loved charting two characters, and yes, we have Sissy who comes into the Gradgrind home, but we also are given Sissy and Bitzer in that opening. Sissy, who cannot define a horse the way that they would like it to be defined, very factual, the number of teeth, exactly what a horse is. And Bitzer, who is the ideal student, who has the ready definition, who has the facts on hand to turn to. And you see these two characters sort of evolve throughout the novel, and Bitzer comes back as this recurring minor character. And in the end, we have a great moment, right, where Gradgrind is faced with Bitzer and essentially asks him, do you have any heart? Did you learn nothing from the education you received at my school after Gradgrind has had his collapse or his conversion, if you will? Did you learn nothing at my school? And Bitzer says, well, I'm the product of your school. Mm-hmm. I'm exactly what you wanted to produce. So I wondered if either of you wanted to speak to that question of education in the novel.
Well, as an educator, still retired, and one of my reasons for retiring was I simply lost to the mesmerizing power of the cell phone, and that I couldn't reinvent the humanities at that level where I was teaching Shakespeare. And I said, listen, you have to buy the play. You can't you can't read it on the phone. I said, the lines are too long. And the student goes, oh, no, they're not. I mean, that to me is sort of an apologue of the whole crisis of the speed dial of everything. And that the novel, I mean, humanities have always been in a contested, space in higher education, because what good is it? And it's not anything that you can, whose benefits you can calculate or measure or anything else like that. We think we ought to keep them around, but they're always being, sort of at more and more to the margin, and more so today than ever before. And the Hard Times ought to be a obligatory reading for every household in America, because it tells us truths about our culture and about ourselves, that the digital approach to reality simply has no access to whatsoever. And it can't be monetized. And people will capitulate to the slogans of, everything isn't about money. But look at our culture. Look at our economy. And look at what's being said about the working poor in our culture. And Dickens has seen that. And by the way, here's a temptation that I will yield to if I can find it. There's a prophetic moment where he, muddle, well, I'll just quote this quick one. Gradgrind sat down in the room with the deadly statistical clock, proving something, no doubt, probably in the main, that the Good Samaritan was a very bad economist. And the Good Samaritan, you see, that's a fiction. It never happened. But it tells the truth that we intuitively accept. So it's a truth story. And our great writers that Rene Girard has made aware is our greatest writers are making up these stories, which are revealing a truth, which is unavailable to ordinary scientific investigation, because it's about human interaction, which are not reducible to punctual facts. And that truth is not a concept. If it's a goal or an ideal, it is reached through a process over time, in space, and the process very often involves a kind of conversion, the falling of the scales from your eyes. And in many Dickens novels, you have this moment of a collapse. There's a point where, maybe I'll get this quoted later, where Gradgrind says, I totally mistrust myself. And he's lost his world, his system, etc. And then he comes back into the human world. But since I can't find my prophetic page, I'll leave it at that.
I mean, some of the other, education thing that comes to mind is just, like the whole struggle that we're always having in the public schools right now, where there's just so little arts education, and that's not prioritized in any way. Sorry, as though, and there's nothing wrong with math and science. Math and science is wonderful, but as though those have so much more to tell us about life and living our life and how, I don't know, than the arts do. So I think that's like an obvious, correlation that you could still pull forward from from them that that the arts are fanciful, that we still kind of have that idea right now. And maybe it's so interesting what you're saying about books and the cell phone, and when the show finally got up and going, because it's a big show with a lot of transitions, and there was so much we had to do once we were in the theater to get it all working. And once I could see it all, I did have a fear of it's it's long. It's long, and it has a pace to it that is like reading the book. And it's different than a lot of the plays that I'm making now, and it's different than a lot of the plays we have at our theater now. And I did have a momentary pause of like, is this, has our attention span changed so much in the last 20 years that this is not going to be relevant, or it's not going to work? It still seems like it is working, but it was a really interesting moment, and as a book lover, I'm finding it makes me nervous, and even with my own children, and how I have to work at getting them to read sometimes.
Oh, yes.
At 14 years of age. Like, in a way, it's like those huge long TV series that people can stream right now are kind of the novel of right now, in a way, where they've got those long story arcs. I don't know. It's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you used the word attention, because attention is at risk, because there are so many choices and thousands of channels and scenes and everything else. We're all aware of this. And we don't know what a culture will be like whose inhabitants have no attention span. My grandchildren go watch something on a screen. They turn on the TV and then they go to their phones and they go back and forth and here and there. And it's like a supermarket of operations. And the thing about a novel is that you sit down alone with this attention-getting device, and you stay with it. And a good novel, it thinks through you, in a sense. When you're reading it, what I love about the stage, I mean, these characters are embodied, and therefore we identify variously or disidentify with them. But the attention that literature requires is something, a fundamental need that is seriously at risk when you want to monetize and digitalize everything. The whole thing about the arts and the humanities is that they are not. And there's that radical difference. And Dickens has already, caught on to that. I found the prophetic passage. It's really hard to believe that. Wait a minute. Sorry. Here it is. It was but a hurried parting in a common street, yet it was a sacred remembrance to those two common people. Utilitarian economics, skeletons of schoolmasters, commissioners of fact, genteel and used-up infidels, gabblers of many little dog's-eared creeds, the poor you will always have with you. Cultivate in them, while there is yet still time, the utmost graces of the fancies and affections, to adorn their lives so much in need of ornament. Or in the days of your triumph, when romance is utterly driven out of their souls, and they in a bare existence stand face to face, reality with a capital R, will take a wolfish turn and make an end of you. I mean, Dickens knew what he was talking about. By the way, he also had been his father was in veterans prison. He had been a factory worker. He knew the worst.
So in Hard Times, we've spoken about several of the characters, and we have such a rich array of Dickensian characters in the work. From Mrs. Sparsit with her Roman features, right, to the hands of Coketown. And I love, Heidi, that you mentioned that many of the actors and actresses actually help with the set changes. I think that's a great image from the novel because they are called the hands and sort of working upon the stage. To the scapegoated Stephen Blackpool, I'll toss the scapegoated out there. We're invited as readers and as viewers to think time and time again about these arcs, about fall and redemption or fall and conversion, right? The beloved paradigm of Girardians. I wondered if you two could speak to which characters you say might be redeemed in the novel. And we've touched upon Gradgrind, but also Bounderby, Tom, Louisa, Stephen Blackpool, Rachel. Who would you say is redeemed in the novel, in the work?
Well, I think Mr. Gradgrind is probably the biggest because he has the furthest to go, and he does go there. Tom, I think he ends with regret, but I don't think he ends on a high note in the novel. I think Louisa is in some ways like the victim of her father's sins. The victim of his system. And Stephen and Rachel, I'm not sure that they were ever lost, they're kind of true to themselves all the way through and kind of have their path is a solid one, you know what I mean? Or it has the full scope of humanity.
Rachel's definitely sort of a counterbalance to the characters who are being confronted with a system, and she's more, as you say, sort of true to herself.
Yeah.
That minor character that's almost corrective to the other arches that we see.
I think Sissy actually has redemption in a way because she starts out as being totally put down. She kind of represents everything that Mr. Gradgrind does not think should exist. But then she ends up kind of quietly and surely being the saving grace of the family, and kind of helping lead them to a better place. And at one point he looks at her and it's like, it's always you, my dear. Like he hasn't really realized the kind of gentle guidance that she's given the whole way through, which has to do with empathy, and her understanding things. And she understands things in a way that Mr. Gradgrind doesn't, even though he thinks she's completely uneducated. So she knows all along that Louise is marrying the wrong person, and she knows all along that Tom's in trouble. She sees and witnesses it all. So she in a way ends up having a bigger grasp on the truth, even though she doesn't have a handle on the facts.
Yeah. All right.
And she's recognized for that by the end of the novel.
I believe me. The character in the play, I don't want to spoil it, but the symmetry between Louisa and Sissy Jupe is, to me, a stroke of genius, because she saves the scene twice. She exiles Hart House, and she finds succor for Tom. And at the end of the novel, Dickens writes this speculative prose about the various characters. And I'll just read what he says about Sissy, which is in the very second to last paragraph. The other ones, for instance, regarding Tom, such things were to be. There's, let's say, a late possibility of his reform. With Louisa, to be a wife and a mother, quote unquote, such things were never to be. But here it is. But happy sissies, happy children loving her, all children loving her. She, grown, learned in childish lore, thinking no innocent and pretty fancy ever to be despised, trying hard to know her humbler fellow creatures and to beautify their lives of machinery and reality with those imaginative graces and delights without which the heart of infancy would wither. See, this is also Dickens' job description. This is a brief for literature. I've got half a dozen passages like this. In which the heart of infancy will wither up. The sturdiest physical manhood will be morally stark death, and the plainest national prosperity figures can show will be the writing on the wall. You can see, by the way, the earlier paragraph, he talks about faith, hope, and charity. this is very Girardian about Dickens. This book is biblically inspired. Part 1 is called Sowing, and Part 2 is called Reaping. But he has no truck with the official clergy in the churches because they're just recruiting agencies. And maybe I'll have the opportunity to quote the hilarious passage on that. But going on with Sissy, writing on the wall, she, holding this course as part of no fantastic vow or bond or brotherhood, i.e. no clergy, church, no establishment, or bond or brotherhood or sisterhood or pledge or covenant. And you see, this is Dickens' glorious overwriting, this catalog aria that he gives us. Or pledge, or government, or fancy dress, or fancy fare, but simply as a duty to be done. Dash. Did Louisa see these things of herself? These things were to be. So in a sense, Sissy's is Louisa's salvation, if you will. And I stop there because I'm going to choke up. Yeah. Sentimentality, Dickens gets to it, and he knows it, and he means it. And he had a powerful influence on culture at a level in which you can't say, oh, well, that's the law he wrote, and that's the law, et cetera, et cetera. But it is this at cultural level. He got the readers on his side by the sentiment and the humor.
Yeah. It's very didactic, it's very funny, and it's very moving, too. Yeah, he's got it all. That's something I really love about Dickens, too, is that how the humor and the pathos just bump right up next to each other and kind of just all the way through, pull all the way through like that, which I think is very lifelike. It's very much like life.
Well, giving away my literary tendencies, I wanted to suggest that maybe we could look at a few moments or a few scenes in the work a little bit more closely. And we had spoken about this before. I'm not sure which one we might like to start with. And you're more than welcome, those of you who are familiar with the work, to suggest somewhere that we might want to look at more closely together. I know we had spoken of Coketown, of that first description of Coketown as the keynote, which Dickens refers to it as. So we could perhaps look at that moment, or we could look at Gradgrind and Louisa, that moment of conversion for him. Where would you like to start?
Oh, I don't. Whatever you guys think.
Well, I would start with Gradgrind and Louisa because this conversion experience in this novel, and it's not the only one. Martin Chuzzlewit, Dombey and Son come to mind offhand of this moment of conversion, which is, you see, truth is something that is the triumph of truth is unconcealment. It's the revealing, the revelation, the unveiling of lies. And the factuality-driven Gradgrind produces this catastrophe in his own family, in his own milieu. And so I'm very taken by the conversation between Gradgrind and his daughter, because it really is radical. It's not just he grows or he learns, he collapses. It's a catastrophe. And Girardi has this idea of total, you have to go to hell. The descent into hell is integral to going there.
And that's a great image, because in the chapter where Gradgrind and Louisa do have this moment, it is called Down, right? Right. And it comes at the end of Mrs. Sparsit's staircase.
And so, Louisa, and Louisa also collapses. I mean, she literally collapses, at that moment,
And if we can, I'll just read a paragraph or two. But, Father, you have trained me from my cradle. Yes, Louisa. I curse the hour in which I was born to such a destiny. He looked at her in doubt and dread, vacantly repeating, curse the hour? Curse the hour? Father, how could you give me life and take from me all the appreciable things that raise it from the state of conscious death? Where are the graces of my soul? Where are the sentiments of my heart? What have you done, O Father? What have you done with the garden that should have bloomed once in the great wilderness here? And she struck herself with both hands upon her bosom. If it had ever been here, its ashes alone would save me from the void in which my whole life now sinks. I did not mean to say this, but Father, you remember the time we last conversed in this room, so when the question was raised about Louisa marrying Bounderby. He had been so wholly unprepared for what he heard now that it was with great difficulty he slowly answered, "Yes, Louisa. What has risen to my lips now would have risen to my lips then if you had given me a moment's help. I don't reproach you, Father. What you have never nurtured in me, you have never nurtured in yourself. But oh, if you had only done so long ago, or if you had only neglected me, what a much better and much happier creature I should have been this day." And on hearing this, after all his care, he bowed his head upon his hands and he groaned aloud.
And he what?
Groaned aloud.
Groaned aloud.
That's in the play.
Yeah, that is in the play. He dies to the world of facts and countability and calculation, etc., to come back as the father of Louisa and of Sissy Jupe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I can't talk.
It is really interesting to think about like the facts and the truth and the moment that we are in our society right now. Because I've been trying to tease that out, like how, because in some ways it's like, Greg Ryan's like, facts alone are wanted in life. That's the main principle. And I've been trying to think about how that applies to now where the facts are so loose. But I guess it has to do with facts versus truth, really. And I guess it has to do with also facts being able to be used to manipulate a situation or using facts to narrate something to yourself, but kind of missing the bigger truth of things. I don't know. It's really interesting to think about.
Well, yeah, I mean, truth is won through a process, and sometimes through a catastrophic process, and that's what Greg Grind experiences through the devastation that you just reported from her daughter, and that you can't again tabulate that. The language in that scene is devastating. He says that I no longer trust myself. He says that let me see, here we go again. Dickens used the word contrition. You see, this is a conversion in the most powerful Pauline sense. And Dickens is very sensitive to that because it evokes faith, hope, and charity at the end of the novel. But Gradgrind says to his daughter, I am sensible that it may not have been a part of my system to invite any confidence from you of any kind. I had proved my system, he stutters, my system to myself, and I have rigidly administered it, and I must bear the responsibility for its failures. It's not just the system isn't true, but that you're responsible for it. You don't replace one system by another and you get a better world. I only entreat you to believe, my favorite child, that I meant to do right. And then the narrator intervenes. He said it earnestly, and to do justice to him, he had, engaging fathomless depths with this little mean excise rod, and in staggering over the universe with his rusty, stiff-legged compasses, he had meant to do great things. Within the limits of his short tether, he had tumbled about, annihilating the flowers of existence with greater singleness of purpose than many of the blatant personages whose company he kept. And that, back in the day, there was this talk of deconstruction and post-structuralism and all that. That's where the whole critique of truth kicked in, and you had to talk about the untruth of truth. And I can't remember where I was going with that. I'll stop there. But that we're still. Oh, I know. When Greg Wright was teaching, and define the dog, and so you get this mathematical formula, and define a flower. And the idea is that you can't have dogs and flowers on the wallpaper because they don't live on wallpaper. You see, it's what back in the cultural wars of higher ed was called a crisis of representation. But every great novelist is always dealing with a crisis of representation. That's his or her job. And the great ones we revere are the ones who do it better. That's all. And we're indebted to Heidi and Lincoln as to bringing this forward. With the strong expectations, people are going to leave that play and say, I didn't know he wrote that. Did he say that? And advance understanding. I'll quote one more quick passage for me from Stephen Blackpool. These are his dying words. And it's when he is rescued from the...
Actually, I was looking for that scene myself because we hadn't spoken much about Stephen Blackpool yet, and I'm not sure how Heidi, how it's adapted for the stage, but there is that very clear moment, right? He descends, he falls into this pit and has to be rescued, and at the same time, Rachel, who has been such a devout figure throughout, needs her own rescuing from Sissy, who's ever present there. But yes, then he's descend and he's pulled out from this pit. And I don't know if you want to read his last words.
It's almost last words. He says, "In my pain," he's lying at the bottom of this pit, and all he can see is the sky. And it's in this very Cockney English, which I will mangle in order to make it some more of it intelligent. "In my pain and trouble, looking up yonder, with it shining on me, this star, I'd seen more clear and had made it in my mind a prayer of all the world may come together more and get a better understanding of one another." That's Dickens' job. And we get a better understanding from Dickens than we get from any of his social science contemporaries, and that we get even from so many of them who are, walking and talking and being on the media today.
Yeah, Stephen has these great, lucid explanations of the divide between the masters and the workers, and he has that great section where he's talking about Bounderby brings him to his house and wants him to talk, what he wants to show him off kind of to this gentleman from London. And he's like, what do you complain about? And he's like, well, I didn't come here to complain. I came because you brought me. And he's like, well, what do you people in a general way complain about? That's the quote. Right. And Stephen's like, well, look at what a muddle we're in. Look at all the amount of people that are brought into being for to piece out a living, who are only here to work and working one way from the cradle to the grave, with no greater purpose, with nothing to be reaching for but death at the end of it. Just, this grind of work. And he's like, who can look at that and say we're not in a muddle? And that's right around when he's saying, look at where we live, look at where we live and look at where you live. Look at how you talks about us. Look at how we're always wrong and you're always right. Who can look on it and say it's not a muddle? And it's so relevant to now. And then his dying wish is that he's looking up at the star, he's getting that bigger view, and just wishing that all that could be cut through and people could just understand each other.
And in that moment, the narrator tells us that Stephen says this without anger. He says it, quote, merely as if it were the truth.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, the thing is, Stephen is the voice of truth. Sissy is the living embodiment of it, and Stephen is the victim of the whole system.
Yeah.
And he doesn't fall into a pit because he's walking his dog, but because he's exiled both by his employees, both by his employers, and by the union. And there's a very Girardian moment there where, in order for the union to circle its wagons, they expel him, you see. So their union is won over against his expulsion simply because he won't join it. But here, when you mentioned a word that reminded me of this passage, where these are also down when he's from the ditch. No, I believe it's, perhaps he's talking to Bounderby, it doesn't matter. He says, for Christ's sakes, don't let the work be murder to him, but spare him for the wives and children that they loves as well as gentlefolks loves theirs. And when it were in work, it killed them without need, and when it's let alone, it kills them without need. See how we die in no need, one way and another, in a muddle every day. You see? Well, again, that has only to, that's the victim of the Ayn Rand vision of the world, which is alive and well and flourishing among us. There's no lack of evidence for that.
Mm-hmm.
Their work be a murder to them.
And on that note, we'd like to open it up for conversation with you, and I'm happy to pass this microphone and for any questions that we have for our speakers to get our dialogue going. Comments are welcome.
Tying into how Suzanne set this up about Montessori and God's here and don't interrupt those who may be talking to him. I was thinking about Dickens, and I'm so excited to see your play tomorrow. But I was inspired as a young kid to want to become a storyteller and a writer. And I thought that the job of a writer was to proclaim the truth. And I grew up as a Mormon kid, so we were going to convert the world. We were going to proclaim the truth to everybody. And the trick was to figure out really great ways in very entertaining capacities to say, this is the truth, I hope you'll buy it. And I got a chance to make films for the Mormon Church. I got a chance to proclaim my understanding of this is the truth. This is the reason God put me on the planet. And then I had, sadly, it took so long, I had this discovery that the purpose of art that I thought was God's way to help us proclaim the truth to each other cleverly and very entertainingly and very sophisticatedly. Purpose of art isn't to do that at all. And the reason I'm so excited to see your play, and I'm reminded of Dickens' genius, is Dickens gets me to ask the right questions. And the truth doesn't come from Dickens. The truth that we recognize is because our hearts, our God, our heaven says, that's the truth. It's not the facts. It's the truth. And it isn't Dickens that claims that he's presenting the truth. He's presenting the situation that allows us to discover the truth. And when we discover it, as much reverence as I have for Dickens, my gratitude to him, and for you who make adaptations of that genius for now, is you provide an opportunity for me to discover the truth in that way that's secure. It's not about what's fake news, what's the right.
Yeah.
We know. And I didn't trust this for forever. And I'm grateful. And my introduction through the Raven Foundation to Girardian thought is I'm hearing these things that I had never heard before. And when you hear them and you go, oh my gosh, is that the way it is? And you think about it and something resonates and says, truth. Mm-hmm. And so, thank you for what you're doing. I can't wait to see that. And I'm so grateful for your pointing out things because it keeps reminding me, ooh, is that the way it is? And then I get this access, as Suzanne said. You didn't interrupt the conversation with God, and I'd go, boom, it's true.
Well, the conversation with God passes through your relation to the other. And that's that thing with that understanding one another. The conversation with God is not, for instance, here, again, I quote Dickens, you can't do better than this. He's describing the churches in Copeland. First, the perplexing mystery of the place was who belonged to the 18 denominations. Because whoever did, the laboring people did not. It was a very strange how few of them, the barbarous jangling of bells that was driving the sick and the nervous mad, called away from their own quarter, from their own close rooms, from the corners of their own streets, where they had lounged listlessly gazing at all the church and chapel going, as at a thing with which they had no manner of concern. And then he goes through a list. Then came the Teetotaler Society. Then came the chemist and the druggist. Then came the experienced chaplain. And the chaplain came from the jail with more tabular statements, outdoing all the previous tabular statements and showing that the same people would support to low haunts hidden from the public eye, where they heard low singing and saw low dancing and mayhap joined in, And then comes Mr. Grangride with his fact-driven thing. And that, yes, because I'm very sensitive to your work in something called entertainment, showbiz. Every time I get together with Heidi, I say, remember, showbiz is my life. I'm a stage Georgiana. But these truths are won through time and won through experience. They're not an it. They're not a concept. They're not available, to tabulation. It doesn't mean that tabulation is worthless calculation, but it's only one half of our dual hemisphere brain. And we have lately, I think, lost balance in that regard.
Yeah, I do love that stories invite you in and invite you to think, in a very different way than like an essay or anything else. It's like, I've been thinking about this a lot just because of the times we're living in, just that the door, it's nice if the door is open to all and we can sit in a room together, and see a story and figure out what we think about it. I don't know. It seems very valuable right now.
Well, we are the storytelling animal. I mean, anthropologically, that's out there. And then we talk about true stories and non-true stories, and we have, fiction and nonfiction. But the greatest truths come from, in Western culture, first come from fiction. And again, I mentioned the Good Samaritan. It never happened, you see. Jesus made it up on the spot. But it has the ring of truth, and it sticks in our craw, even to this day. Even to this day.
I was really struck when Grace was reading the lines of Louisa saying, if you'd only neglected me, Dad, things would have been better. And, she was referring to if you just hadn't force-fed me your agenda. But the truth was he did neglect her in that he never saw her. And I wonder if you could talk about this. We talk about in mimetic theory the delusion we have of our self-sufficiency, that we don't need anyone. We're complete unto ourselves. And it seems that Mr. Gradgrind was a victim of that sense of completeness, and his children suffered obviously because of it. So.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely true. They do both suffer from that. And Bitzer ends up being such a model of that thinking. He has that thing. He says like, I have only one defeat, and it's the person I most like defeat.
Right.
Which seems like very, very much like what you're saying, that the idea of self-sufficiency. And Bounderby claims that too. Just that idea of look out for yourself, and that's all you need.
Right. America is still prey to the idol of individualism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
My house, my car, my dog, my gun, by the way. So.
Yeah.
But really, and the thing is that a good novel never buys into that, because it's all interaction, and we're individuals. But the self-made man, our greatest fortunes, the Rockefellers and the Goulds, and we still are entrapped by those models. And the self-made man is this creature of the Revolutionary era, where people were free to make their own fortune, and that having done it and having succeeded, I won. There can't be anything wrong with this. And by the way, all my friends won too, because they're the only people I know.
Yeah. Well, and the self-made man is tied into privilege in a way that the self-made men don't always see.
Yes, I was struck. Andrew, you were reading the thoughts of Stephen Blackpool as he lay in the bottom of that pit, looking up at the stars above. And I remembered a passage in Great Expectations. It comes right after Pip has been told by Joe that Joe married Pip's sister because in part, he didn't say it explicitly, but he was implying he wanted to help take care of that little boy, whom Pip's sister was not taking care of, really. And immediately after that, Pip says, my admiration of him increased. And then he said, I went outside and I looked at the stars. And this is the connection. And I thought to myself, and at this time, of course, the convict Magwitch is out on the marshes and it's freezing cold. I thought to myself how terrible it would be to lie freezing out on those marshes and to look up at the stars and to feel that no one cares, that nothing in the universe cares. And I'm asking this partly because you mentioned Stephen Blackpool as a kind of scapegoat. And you've also mentioned the ways in which Dickens dismisses a lot of religious rhetoric and institutions and, what Tennyson called our little systems that have their day. I was wondering how you would connect these elements to a larger view that Dickens might be conveying, if it's possible to do that. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, my own are nurtured, if you will, tributary to Dickens, is that he is a novelist, therefore he is heir to the storytelling tradition, which is literature, which is heir to the Old and New Testaments. That gives fiction a license to practice, and there's a long genealogy, and people can look that up. But that, in a sense, he has this sense, religion is much too important to be left to the churches. Well, that is to say, you have the established church, and then you have the descending church. Anthony Trollope is very funny about that, as you know. And what is the descending? Well, they're descending from the established church. What the established church is doing? Well, they're fighting off the dissenters. And by the way, you can read all of Trollope and never know. You never know that Jesus Christ has existed at all. These are establishment rivalries. And Dickens is very anti-clerical. Mimetic theory comes along to recognize that the most powerful impulse that Christianity inherits from Israel precisely is that self-critical tradition. And so it also is a possibility for renewal. And Suzanne just quoted, the present Pope, who is very aware and he's a Jesuit after all. And is very in tune with these issues for our times. So that self-critical tradition, which is runs through our whole heritage, and really, I think, at its best moments we find in fiction, is something that Dickens is heir to over against the official representations. And I'll just read this one passage to that point. These are these sort of prophetic passages asking about what's the destiny of these characters. He says, here was Mr. Gradgrind on the same day and in the same hour sitting thoughtful in his own room. How much of futurity did he see? Because Dickens, you see, he knows that this situation is correctable. We don't have to be this bad and this blind. He has an agenda, but it is to persuade his readers, to a compassionate relationship to one another, which is only available precisely through empathy and the imagination. How much of futurity did he, underlined, see? Did he see himself, a white-haired, decrepit man, bending his hitherto inflexible theories to appointed circumstances, making his facts and figures subservient to faith, hope, and charity, and no longer trying to grind that heavenly trio in his dusty little mill?
I love that. That's what.
And so Dickens is part of that ongoing self-critical tradition that you find in the Hebrew Bible and that Jesus brings forward, which is why you and I teach literature.
I was thinking too when you asked that question just about empathy and imagination, which of course you said, just that the act of an artist, or at least maybe a storytelling artist, is to is to imagine yourself in somebody else's position and to empathize with it and to kind of leave no soul behind in a way. I don't know. I think that is definitely an impulse behind being a theater artist and certainly being a novelist, I would imagine.
Other questions or comments?
And Lyle has it.
I think I'm responding to exactly what you just said, Heidi, because I want to hear more about how that works. I've been thinking as we discuss the relevance of sentiment and of pathos in literature for doing that work that gets in at something in us and then causes that thing to kind of rear up and exalt and say this is truth. My wife and I have been watching the new ABC drama The Good Doctor, right, which is about an autistic surgeon who has to, it's a team of surgeons who has to work with him, and he's brilliant. It's like House, except the main character isn't a complete jerk, and it's you feel for him the whole time. And I think there's a lot of other potential here, getting at the competition that goes into the hospital and all these doctors saying that they're being objective and looking out for the best of their patients, and they're clearly not. But that gets sidelined to put attention on this disabled doctor whose lack of social interface gives him extraordinary intelligence. But a lot of initial reviews of the show have said that there's a kind of emotional kidnapping going on, right, or a kind of blackmail, because it gets you emotionally invested in the character by presenting all the trauma that he's been through, and you just can't help but root for him, right? He's the underdog, and everything's gone wrong, and you just feel so much for him, but there's so much suspicion built up around that very idea, right? If I'm being made to feel something for this character, someone's got it in on there's a strategy going on.
Or it could feel exploitative of the of that
exactly
situation.
Especially in your adaptation of Hard Times and yourself as an artist and as somebody who's working through this. We live in a world that's been made suspicious of sentiment, right? You're suspicious of pathos and you're on the lookout for it. And how do you envision what sort of rehabilitation is needed right now to make pathos is maybe better than sentiment, to make pathos something that's believable to us in the 21st century? And what kind of strategies can arts employ to maybe move in that direction?
Gosh, that's a really interesting question I don't know the answer to at all. With Dickens, you have to embrace, to doing that adaptation, you have to embrace the sentimentality, because that's one of his main ways of accomplishing what he wants to accomplish. We were kind of having a conversation about that earlier. Did you want to talk about that for one second?
Well, the empathy is a discovery of Adam Smith, of all people, Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he describes it again and again and again as simply putting yourself, well, this is my paraphrase, but you put yourself in the position of the other and see the world from that point of view, which means you identify with the other. And by the way, since Anne Estelle is here from Notre Dame, she can tell you a lot more about empathy than I ever could. But that's what drama enforces upon you, if you will, as does narrative fiction. And if it's good, it pulls you in. It doesn't mean that all fictions are good, but the idea that you can not avoid this encounter with the other, and so there's rivalry and all these kinds of things. Your question, Lyle, goes to that's the question for a whole society. I don't think it's a question of reviving pathos. It's a question of reviving or just saving empathy, because that word is in the news. It's in the headlines, the lack of empathy from certain quarters. And in a culture which is simply going according to a winner-loser ratio, there's no room for empathy at all. It's a question of in a sense that there's losers and winners, and empathy is all on the horizontal level, etc. But I mean, believe me, your question is the question for this country, which is, by the way, still the league leader in power, wealth, and everything else. We're responsible for the worst things that happen in the world simply because we're the most powerful. And that's the question for today, for this century in particular, because things are sort of coming to a head.
I mean, I think it's also, my mind also goes to like Hollywood. And so there's use of pathos or sentimentality to sell things a lot in our culture. And it's tricky. And that's why that stuff can come off kind of cheesy sometimes too. And, I guess it's just like, why is it being employed? Like, is there a higher reason, or is it just to entertain? I don't know. And entertaining is fine too. I don't know the answer. It's so interesting, but of course I think about it a lot because that's my field. So I don't know. I guess it just has to feel truthful. And it means that means different things at different times, which is, so I don't know, but that is a fascinating question.
Sentiment of work, pointing me to something, whatever that is, it can't be what was just described earlier. This is not how I discovered the truth.
Yes. If I'm being manipulated there. Yeah. Dickens just does it shamelessly, joyously, beautifully.
Yes.
And you're just like, you either go along for that ride or you don't,
Well,
so.
This famous Oscar Wilde's quip about you, if you can, let's see if I get it right. How can anybody read The Death of Little Nell in the Old Curiosity Shop without bursting out laughing? So you say he overdoes it, but the thing is, it is very effective. And the short answer to all this is Pascal. He says the heart has its reasons that reason doesn't know. Reason is very effective, and it's very powerful, and it's calculated, and it gives all kinds of machines and gadgets and things like that. But the fact is we are embodied creatures, and that has the embodiment is so much more about the heart than the mind. And I agree with Ian McGilchrist, who has written this wonderful book called The Master and His Emissary. And it's about left and right hemispheres. And he's saying that our world is, in tilt. We sort of capitulated to calculation, hard, cold facts, and every kind of digitalized fascination. But that's the challenge of every culture in every century. But the fact is today, it seems the challenges are much more massive, and dangerous. By the way, look at that. Isn't that quite wonderful? That's all the water you'll ever see in the world. Well, it won't be there forever if we decide that's another exploitable resource. On the other side of the lake, the French are pumping it out as fast as they can to sell bottles of water to ship on, tankers to bring back here. It's a really crazy world. And Dickens would have looked around and said, oh my God, it's science fiction.
Dickens uses every tool in the book, too. He's not subtle in any way. No. With his arguments, too, like he sets them up, like, in an extreme. And I think the fun of it is just his intellect and his energy and his passion and, like, that kind of, like, okay, I would like to be manipulated by you. I will go along on this ride. You know what I mean? But I do know what you're saying, though, because there's ads that I get mad, because I feel like they've got some formula and they do the exact thing that's going to make me get weepy, and it just makes me mad, for some product that I'm supposed to buy. So I totally understand what you're saying, but I guess it just has to be done well.
Well, it has to be done. BBC produced a series of Dickens novels, and they're in a long series, so they give them time. You send those to Hollywood, they have an hour and 45 minutes, they jam it and cram it, and by the way, it has to end well. Because bad ending is bad box office. End of story. but film first, and then TV, and now all our media are simply heir to the narrative tradition that goes from Israel to gospel to something called Western literature around the Renaissance. And our media entertainments are part of that, and therefore accomplice to it. And we have to be vigilant about that too. I don't watch TV. I simply couldn't stand it after a while. But at my age, I'm entitled to just, turn it off. There's lots of really wonderful stuff out there, and lots of just really, there's too much advertising for one. So, and by the way, every advertising is a little narrative, You get this, and you go from, a not so great situation to a new situation everybody admires and envies you. All of advertising is driven by, mimetic desire.
Just to point to a scene that might be worth talking about right now is the scene where, and I don't remember the character's name, but the hand who's trying to whip the crowd up against Blackpool.
Yes.
Slackbridge.
Yes.
Slackbridge, because that's, Heidi's, I think, pointing to the thing that it's like, to what purpose are you raising my emotions? Like, what's the reason? And the crowd there, it's a very interesting dynamic with him trying to whip up the crowd, and the crowd in a way resisting, maybe a little, like Lyle's pointing to, a little modern cynicism about, why are you trying to get me all riled up here? So I don't know if you could talk about that scene, because you kind of touched on that scapegoating scene, but didn't really get into the dynamics of the crowd and the guy trying to whip him up. And
I'm not sure I even really remember. There is a scene like that in the play, but it's very reduced.
Right. Yes, but there is that scene,
yeah.
and it's in tandem, and also at the end, Stephen Blackpool, gets to tell us what the truth is.
Yeah, yeah.
And the point is, of course, he doesn't use the T word, because that doesn't allow for the contextual nature and the narrative nature of truth, not the Bible thumping, Bible pulpit slamming. But the scene in which Blackpool is thrown out, voted out by his fellow workers, it's astonishing. They need the union. And see, think about Dickens. He knows that we have institutions and capital industry, and therefore we'll have unions. But he smells a rat also, that these unions can also be exploitive, and therefore can be violent and exclusionary. And the history of union labor organization includes that too.
Other questions or comments for our speakers? Good. Well, we'll adjourn for a short break then. You're welcome to enjoy refreshments, to take them out the store if you'd like, and take in the lake. But before we do so, please join me in thanking our speakers.